We also talked about this style of writing, pretty unique. And I liked in my research for all these different prophets that I taught how there were these unique writing styles that I didn't realize before. I just kind of assumed, not having really dug in, that each prophet kind of has a similar style of writing. But it's neat that these different prophets write in a very different way. So Malachi has this unique approach where you have these six, one commentator called them disputations, but it's this style of writing, didactic, dialectic. Again, I'm not a big literature guy, but essentially what that is, you have a charge made, in this case by God through Malachi, a charge is made, and then the hearers, the listeners, so the people and the priests, they raise an objection to that, and it's usually in the form of a question: in what way have we done this thing? And then Malachi comes back with a counter argument that is offered by the speaker. And this happens 6 times throughout the book. And one commentary that I was reading on Malachi, actually, instead of dividing the book up kind of by chapters or topics, divided it up by the those 6 different disputations. And I think if I were to go back and redo this, that's how I would have done it. Kind of take one of those 6 individually and look at them. But be looking for that. You will run across some of those in our reading this evening. And then real quick, before we pick up in verse 10 of chapter 2, just real brief overview. Some big topics from chapter 1. So he starts off early on in chapter 1, reminding the people that they are loved by God before he gets into the fact that you have messed up. But reminding them, you are loved by God, but you've got to fix this form of worship. And then so starting in verse 6 and then going all through the rest of chapter 1 and then even down through chapter 2, you've got all these different ways where worship has become very lazy, and they have allowed a lot of practices to happen in their worship that they shouldn't have. So you can see in verse 8, sacrificing the blind, the lame, the sick. In verse 13, even bringing stolen sacrifice. And then also in verse 13, just the attitude towards the whole process. It says, "Oh, what a weariness! These priests, they're just over it. This is tiresome. We can't continue doing this." So lots of issues here with the priests. He continues his discussion in the beginning of chapter 2 about the corrupt priests, and even referencing how their time of having responsibility and a position, that time is coming to an end. He's going to take that away. So as a part of that punishment, they're going to have their responsibility and their position of power taken away from them eventually. So with that serving as an introduction, do you want to have a comment that they'd like to make before we get into the rest of chapter 2?
I think with that style of writing, it really does come across as quite antagonistic. It's like you can argue with God, but arguing with God has its place, but it has to be done very respectfully, humbly, and in small doses. And there are other people in the Bible that argue with God. There are Psalms that say, "Why is this happening, God? Where are you? Why won't you rescue me?" Mm-hmm. Job certainly has questions that he wants to ask of God. Like Job even frames it in terms of like almost like a court of law. Like, hey, if God would just show up and we could just talk, the two of us face to face, I have a lot of questions for him. So it's like arguing with God has a place. But as you read Malachi, it starts to get like uncomfortable as you're reading it because they're so defensive that there's almost nothing that God can say that they're not like, objection.
Right.
It's like, just the annoying lawyer in a movie. He's like, objection. And it gets really, really uncomfortable as you read this book.
Right. Yeah, I kind of imagine as I'm reading through these, that first statement is made, and then they come back with, "Well, in what way have we done that?" And then he answers them, and I'm imagining saying, "Oh, yeah, we did do that." Okay, let's start with chapter 2 in verse 10, and we'll kind of read a couple of chunks at a time, make a few comments, and go over some observations about that. So let's just start with the first 3 verses here, and you're going to notice we're going to get into a section where Malachi is bringing up issues related to marriage that the people have had. So could somebody please read verses 10 through 12?
Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously with one another by profaning the covenant of our fathers? Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned the Lord's holy institution, which he loves. He has married the daughter of a foreign god. May the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob the man who does this, being awake and aware, yet who brings an offering to the Lord of hosts.
Okay, so we're starting off here our discussion with these issues related to marriage. So verse 11, marrying the daughter of a foreign god. So something that they were expressly told that they could not do early on in their old covenant relationship, and this is something they've done time and time again throughout their history. And it's interesting to see they're being described here as covenant breakers. What are some of the descriptions that you saw given in those 3 verses for what it is that they're doing? Well, we know what they're doing, but how is it described? What words are used?
Unfaithful, dissolved.
Yeah. Very good. Other adjectives there?
Abomination.
Okay. Abominable, yeah. Profane. Some translations, you might have something different in 11, but you've dealt treacherously. It's described as an abomination there. So we've got all these descriptions of what is going on. This is obviously something that they've done that is very wrong. Any thoughts when you read that in those first couple verses of Israel being practicing this infidelity?
What was the problem with both Ezra and Nehemiah? Both books end with this issue of marrying the foreign women. Ezra chapters 9 and 10, and then Nehemiah also. Nehemiah brings it up in chapter 13, down in verse 23 and 24. And so both Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi takes place with, at least broadly within the framework of Ezra and Nehemiah,
Right.
Late Nehemiah. But the fact that Ezra and Nehemiah are literally dealing with this, intermarriage of foreign women, and that Malachi brings it up, seems it was a pretty comprehensive problem they were facing.
Yeah. Was God being too strict with this rule not to do this? What were maybe some practical reasons he had for preventing this?
Solomon?
Yeah.
It always ended badly.
2 very good answers, yes. Other reasons, like think of the major theme of the minor prophets. What have been brought in? Idolatry. So
It's the fact that these foreign women who are unconverted to God, these are foreign women who bring their foreign gods. I think the language there when he says marries the daughter of a foreign god.
Right.
It's not the fact that someone is a Moabite or an Ammonite or whatever. It's the fact that these are unconverted. These are not proselytized
Right.
to where they're believing in God.
And the type of influence that would bring.
It's Jezebel, right? Jezebel was the daughter of a priestess of Baal, and look what the influence that she had, multi-generational influence, Israel and Judah.
Yep. Exactly. Let's look at these next 2 verses now, and as we read, so they've been given this charge. They've been marrying these foreign women, these daughters of other gods, and I want you to look at what is said here about bringing tears upon the altar of the Lord. Could somebody read 13 and 14 for me, please?
Here's another thing you do. You cover the Lord's altar with tears, weeping and groaning, because he pays no attention to your offering and doesn't accept them with pleasure. You cry out, why doesn't the Lord accept my worship? I'll tell you why. Because the Lord witnessed the vows you and your wife made when you were young. But you have been unfaithful to her, though she remained your faithful partner, the wife of your marriage vows.
Okay, so there was some disagreement whenever I was so whoever it was, these great tears, there's weeping, crying, verse 13, so that God does not regard their offering anymore. And here you have one of these questions raised in verse 14. Yet you say, so he's not receiving their offering, and yet you say, for what reason? And then we have an explanation. Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth with whom you dealt treacherously. Yet she is your companion and the wife by covenant. So these people have been breaking their covenant with God.
Jacob, do you think the implication is, and if you just said this, I'm so sorry, but is the implication that they may have divorced their wives for foreign wives? Is that the...
Yes, everything
Okay.
that I had read, that's the way
Okay.
that I was looking. Not just marrying foreign women, but also putting them away. And he's going to get into that topic of divorce here in a second. We'll see in verse 16 this passage. A lot of people know well that he hates divorce, but yeah, that is the opinion that I saw. Okay, getting into these next couple verses here. Let's start in verse 15 and finish out chapter.
To show us not just the covenant between a man and a woman, but the covenant between humanity and its creator. And as God uses marriage, like in Hosea, God uses marriage to teach us about his relationship to us. I think there's a bigger reason. He hates divorce, not just because of what it does to us, but because divorce is also very violent toward keeping the covenant, all covenants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a very good thought. It's
you think
a broken covenant.
the first, the first love or whatever being relationship of Israel with God, which they have gone away from. So God's saying, I was your first love, and you've gone away from me. Now you're into this world that I don't approve of.
Yeah, I think that is a theme that occurs a lot in the prophets. Absolutely. Yeah, being unfaithful to him in that way. I think it's a very good point. All right, we're going to get into chapter 3, and then chapter 4 is very short. One neat thing to be looking for in chapters 3 and 4 are these prophecies related to a coming messenger. That's a neat topic, and with some of these sections that we're going to read, there's very, very clear prophecy pointing to an event in the future. So be looking for that as we read. So let's start by reading. Somebody can take chapter 3 and read the first 2 verses for me. We'll make a couple observations there.
Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap.
All right. So where have we seen that that phrase before, that concept of a messenger preparing the way?
John the Baptist.
Yeah, John the Baptist. There's a lot of places where we could go. There's a kind of a similar prophecy. Let's turn back to the book of Isaiah in chapter 40. Somebody please read Isaiah 40 and verse 3 for us.
Verse 3.
Yes, please.
A voice is calling, clear the ways of the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God.
All right, so I do think that's probably the more well-known passage of that prophecy of John the Baptist, that the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. But this one in Malachi, also fairly well-known too. Who's another prophet that John is compared to? Elijah. And where do we see that? Somewhere. It's accurate. Does anyone remember? There's a couple places you can see it.
Chapter 4, verse 5.
Yeah, it's interesting. One is right here in this very book, and we'll get to that in a little bit when we get to chapter 4.
And then Matthew 17.
Right, and so you start to see now references to John the Baptist referring to him as Elijah, which is very interesting. How did John? Do you remember how John reacted to that idea of being compared to Elijah? He denied it. You know, he didn't want to be compared to Elijah. But then Jesus is the one that confirms it. Ryan referenced Matthew 17. Go to Matthew 17 real quick, and then we should have no doubt at that point what Malachi is referring to. So to Matthew 17 and verse, somebody read 11 through 13.
Jesus answered and said to them, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already. And they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. And the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist.
All right, so it's told very expressly there, very simply, that this reference to Elijah is referring to John. And then, just in case you needed even more proof, in Luke 1, the angel that is speaking to Zacharias, we're looking kind of around that time of the birth of John. So Luke 1, verse 16, speaking of John, he will turn away many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will also go before him, Christ, in the spirit and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of their fathers to their children and the disobedient, and wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So, John the Baptist very clearly kind of referenced as Elijah several times in the New Testament, and then it's neat that one of the first places we see that is right here in Malachi. So he's just referring to him as my messenger here in chapter 3, but when we get to chapter 4 later on in verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah. So it's pretty neat reference there of a messianic prophecy. Okay, let's look at verses 3 through 5. We may not read all of chapter 3, but let's at least get through 3 through 5, and then I want to read verse 6. But somebody read 3 through 5.
He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, and in the days of old, as in former years. Say 5.
5, please.
Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired worker in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourner and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts.
So one of the major problems in almost all of the minor prophets was the priesthood and the sins that they were practicing, whether it's Malachi and it's the indifference, or we have in other prophets just simply greed has been a problem before with the priest class, just bringing God the leftovers. There's been all these issues. The priests were not doing their job. Another major issue the priests had was they were charged with teaching the people about God, and they had failed in doing that. So, since we are getting close here to the priesthood ending, what is this time that he is referring to? He is mentioning here, look at verse 3 again, they are going to offer to the Lord. They're going to come back to those offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasant to the Lord, just like the days of old, as in the former years. What might this be a reference to? When is the priest class going to offer sacrifices the way that they should?
If it's talking about the church, it could be that we are all the priests.
Right.
Trying to be as righteous as we can through Jesus.
Yeah, this could possibly be a reference at spiritual temple and a spiritual priesthood. You can read about that, for example, in 1 Peter chapter 2, this concept of the priesthood under the new covenant. So I thought that was a neat reference. Even though it seems like in the prophets at this time, because they were never going to do what they're supposed to do, but he's referencing there is a time coming up when the priests will offer sacrifices the way they should, and they'll do that in a spiritual temple under the new covenant. So, any comments from that section? Anything that stood out to you?
I mean, that idea of there's going to be something, a time coming when everybody's going to worship me like they're supposed to, has been a theme for a long time with the prophets and such, in various forms, and not necessarily with the priesthood, but, just that idea that whatever you're doing now, it's not it.
Right.
There's a time coming when, and Jesus eventually references it later, he talks to the woman at the well, that there's that time coming when the true worshiper is going to worship me in spirit and in truth. It's not about the mountain. It's not about the physical sacrifices. It's much more than all that.
Exactly.
So this, again, you can understand why they don't get it. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten it.
Right.
Just said that to me. But looking back, you can see very clearly this is, all part of that big picture that God has something much bigger planned.
Yeah. Very good. That reference from a minute ago was 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into marvelous light. So there is a time coming when there'll be a priesthood that does worship and offer, just like the days of old when it was done righteously.
That verse was our theme, by the way. Hopefully everybody remembers.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, don't forget the theme verse. Verse 6 has a very good concept, a truth of old. Somebody read verse 6 for us.
For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed.
All right, so just a good concept there that the people needed a reminder of. God does not change. We'll try to move through the rest of chapter 3 quickly. I don't think we'll have time to read it all, and then we'll slow down again when we get to chapter 4. But you're going to see in verses 7 through 9, if you just want to kind of look over there, this concept of the people robbing God. So here we go, another one of those questions. How have we done this? So look at verse 8 and 9. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. So this idea of robbing God, this is very troubling to see. Stealing in general is obviously condemned under the old law. They're not just stealing; they're stealing from God. They're robbing God. So a great charge that is brought against them. And then he gets into some ways that they have done that in verses 10 and 11. But he's rebuking them for that. And then, starting in this section, verses 13 through 15, you have a complaint that is brought. So look at this complaint in verse 13. Everybody drop down to chapter 3, verse 13. Your words have been harsh against me, says the Lord. Yet you say, in what way have we spoken against you? You said, it's useless to serve God. What profit is it that we keep his ordinance and that we walk as mourners before the Lord of hosts? So now we call the proud blessed, for those who do wickedness are raised up. They even tempt God and go free. So how would you kind of summarize this complaint in kind of layman's terms?
They don't see the tangible evidence of being faithful to God.
Right.
But they see people who are wicked get all the glory.
Right.
And they're thinking, well, I couldn't be like that because this dude's doing fine.
Right. It's an age-old complaint. I mean, we've seen this time and time again. We see it today. What's the point of serving God? Why have we wasted our time serving God? And it's pretty interesting, and it kind of reminds me of something that we covered when Ryan had Zechariah in chapter 7. Their evidence to point to the fact that they should have been blessed had to do with outward things that they had done and think that was going to save them. So keeping ordinances and walking as mourners. So look at these things we have done. We should be blessed because we have been doing these things. But what was the problem?
Everybody else was getting blessed. He kept on saying, you'll get blessed. And people being people, they're probably getting aggravated. Everybody else getting blessed, and they're just like,
yeah, for sure. They're definitely frustrated for it. What's a theme we've seen in the prophets about? You are doing all these things, all these worship practices. You're covering your bases. You're doing X, Y, Z. But what's the big problem? Yeah, their heart was not in it. Okay, so their heart was not in what they were doing. They may have been keeping some ordinances. Their heart wasn't in it, but they're technically doing this and that. They're perhaps even showing mourning at the right time. But the problem is an issue with the heart. And then verse 15 kind of reminds me of the complaints about, for example, the Babylonians. And, they're wicked. Why do we get to see them conquering us? So a very old complaint there that we've seen many times and we even see today, which I found interesting. And then look at the end of chapter 3. This is pretty interesting. In verse 16, there's a reference here to a book that was perhaps written down. Not something we know very much about, but it would seem interesting. So you've got verses 13 through 15 where you got these complainers. But it seems, if you read verse 16, that not everyone was like that. There were some people who did fear the Lord. So in verse 16, those that feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened, and he heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on his name. So it's obviously nothing we know very much about, but it would be interesting to see what words were written down. But there were a group of people that did fear God. They were not the complainers from those previous verses. And the things that they said pleased the Lord. And they were written down as a book of remembrance. Final thoughts on chapter 3.
I just thought that was interesting when they were talking about robbing God. God challenges them, say, bring me what's due mine and see if I don't do amazing things for you. I'm not doing it because you're not doing what I asked you to do. But try me, do what I asked you to do and see if I don't shower you with blessings, see if I don't, make your fields abundant, the language that's used there, go ahead, put me to the test, see, and he's used that kind of language before, try me, put me to the test, do what I asked you to do and see if I don't follow through with what I said I'm going to do, And I wonder, and sometimes for us too, if we don't have the faith enough that God is actually going to do what he said he's going to do. In good things, especially, that, if you'll put me first, you'll do what I've asked you to do, see if I don't take care of you,
Right.
But well, I don't know, coming twice a week, that's an awful lot sometimes,
Right.
Or whatever it is, right? That's holding you back. It can be a lot of things, but just see if I don't take care of you like I said I'm going to.
Yeah, that's a very good thought. Yeah, will a man rob God? Okay, if I could have someone just chapter 4 is rather short. Could somebody just read chapter 4 for us? We'll make a few comments about chapter 4, and then we'll be done.
For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them with neither root nor branch. But for those who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall, and you shall tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the soles of your feet, on the day when I act, says the Lord of hosts. Remember the law from my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction.
Okay, so we've got this this section here about a great day of the Lord, a coming day of the Lord. It's obviously a day of judgment that's referenced here. And then in it, we also have verse 5, that interesting reference there to, behold, I will send you Elijah before the coming of the great day of the Lord. So again, the day of the Lord, that's been a common theme in several of our prophets, and there's times where this is referring to the final judgment, that final great day of the Lord, but there's also been plenty of times where there are references to the fact that there's many days of the Lord, any time that he is going to bring judgment upon sinners can be described as a day of the Lord. Look at verse 2. This is kind of an interesting topic here. But to those who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise. Who has Son capitalized in verse 2? Some of us.
S-U-N.
S-U-N, yeah. So when that happens, what are the translators trying to imply? Right, that this is messianic. It's interesting though that essentially no commentators that I looked at agreed that it was a messianic prophecy, rather just a simple statement of fact that just righteousness is God's righteousness is being described like the sun that will arise and shine on them. Look at verse 2. Behold, but to you who fear my name, so, those who are actually practicing righteousness and fearing God, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in its wings, and you shall go out and grow fat like stall-fed calves. So all these different blessings that were going to be brought on them. But I found it interesting just doing some research on that, how a lot of people don't take this to be messianic, but clearly a lot of people that translated our Bibles did take it as messianic. And it certainly seems like it could be. I think that's a fine application to make, whichever way that you take it. Brian?
Yeah, John chapter 1, I think provides some evidence to support that. There's a sequence in John 1 verses 6 through 9 that say John the Baptist, Jesus, light reference. John 1:6, there came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came for a witness that he might bear witness of the light, that all might believe through him. Now he was not the light, but came that he might bear witness of the light. Now there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. And that's speaking of Jesus being the light. Doesn't use sun, S-U-N, I get it. So we're talking about light versus sun,
Right.
But I find it really hard to believe that that's just coincidence.
Yeah. Certainly with all the references to light when referring to Jesus, that's a very easy application if you wanted to make that, absolutely. Just kind of coming to a close here.
Can I make a comment on verse 1 before
Yeah, go
you
for it.
wrap it up? I'll keep it quick.
Yeah.
Verse 1 talks about in that day it will leave them neither root nor branch. And I think it's really interesting that John the Baptist himself doesn't directly quote this, but in Matthew 3 verse 10, John the Baptist says, the axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire.
Yeah.
And again, Malachi 4:1, so that it will, there's a day coming that will set them ablaze, that will leave them neither root nor branch. And here's John the Baptist saying, the axe is here. The axe is here.
Yeah.
So I think it's just really cool. I think John the Baptist really, really understood what his mission was.
Yeah, absolutely. Malachi ends his book here at the end. He has an exhortation for the people to remember and observe the law. So get back to practicing the law. And in the future, there's going to be someone coming to prepare you for this day of the Lord that he has been referencing in chapter 4. And verse 6, he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. So ending there with a warning as well as an encouragement to follow the law. So a couple of applications just from the second half of Malachi here. Number one, I found that whole dialogue very interesting, all the way from 10 to 17 in chapter 2, that concept of marriage and divorce, and how he's very upset with the people for leaving their wives and seeking these women of foreign gods. And they're described as being covenant breakers. And we kind of broke that down a little bit earlier. And Ryan mentioned how that's God's big issue with divorce, is that a covenant is being broken. So I think it's important to remember that marriage is not only a covenant between a man and a woman, it's also a covenant with God. And take that very seriously if it's broken. And then that verse, chapter 3 and verse 8, Kevin was talking about this a little bit more as well. It's unbelievable to think of the concept that these people were trying to rob from God, and just the severity if you really think about what you're doing. Just stealing alone is bad according to the law. Imagine stealing from God. So, all right, guys, I appreciate it. It was a good quarter. Hopefully you got something out of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob.
Thank you, guys.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your comments.
Good to be with them.
Hey, no problem, thanks for doing that.
The next 3 days.
Nice having a break.
Yeah. Not working out with the site.
Yeah. That wouldn't work, yeah.
I'm gonna sing you a question.